The snow falling over Oakhaven didn't look like the glitter on a postcard. It looked like ash. Arthur Finch stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, the heavy wool of his ox-blood coat absorbing the moonlight. Every breath he took felt like swallowing cold needles. It was a familiar sensation that reminded him of the cold, damp walls of Cell Block C. 10 years had passed since he last stood on this soil. 10 years of silence, stolen from him by a gavel's strike on a bitter Christmas Eve. They had taken his shop, his reputation, and his life, all to protect a web of lies woven by the town's elite. But as he adjusted the weight of the burlap sack on his shoulder, Arthur knew that tonight the debt would be collected in full. He moved through the outskirts of town with the ghost-like precision of a man who had memorized these streets in his mind for a decade. Every alleyway, every shortcut, and every blind spot in the streetlights was etched into his brain. He wasn't the man people remembered, the kind-hearted toymaker who gave out free whistles to kids. He was something harder now, something forged in the yard of a maximum security prison. His first stop was the sprawling colonial estate of Sheriff Miller. The house was a garish display of forced cheer, draped in so many lights it seemed to hum with electricity. Arthur stood in the tree line for a long time, watching the patterns of the house. He saw Miller's wife through the kitchen window pouring cocoa for their 2 daughters. He watched the warmth and the laughter, things he had forgotten existed. It would have been easy to burn the house down with them inside, but Arthur wanted Miller to feel a different kind of pain, the kind that comes from knowing you're never safe in your own home. Arthur didn't need to break a window. He knew the back way, through the mudroom where the lock had always been faulty. Inside, the air was suffocatingly warm and smelled of pine needles. He drifted through the hallway, a massive red shadow passing the framed family photos. He paused at the door of the master bedroom, listening to the rhythmic, unsuspecting breathing of the sheriff's wife. Instead of violence, Arthur descended into the basement. With the steady hands of the master craftsman he used to be, he opened the internal intercom system. He wired a vintage tape recorder into the house's speakers, setting a timer. Then he went to the children's playroom. He spent an hour there, not destroying a single thing, but meticulously rearranging the world of the Miller family. When Sheriff Miller's phone buzzed at the police station an hour later, he thought it was just another routine notification. But when he opened the live security feed, his breath hitched. The camera showed the hallway outside his children's rooms. Every single doll and action figure his daughters owned was standing in a rigid, perfect circle, all facing his bedroom door. Each one bore a small, handwritten tag with the date, December 24th, 2014. Miller scrambled to his feet, his chair clattering to the floor. Before he could reach for his keys, the station's radio frequency began to hiss with static. Then, a voice filled the room. It was Miller's own voice from 10 years ago, caught in a secret recording Arthur had guarded like a treasure. "Just pin it on the Toymaker. Nobody will care about a guy like Finch." Miller looked out the station window, and for a fleeting second, he saw a mountain of a man in a red coat standing under the flickering street lamp. By the time he reached the door, there was nothing but a single brass bell hanging from the handle, vibrating in the wind. Arthur was already miles away, navigating the winding, salt-crusted roads toward the Blackwood cabin. Judge Halloway liked his privacy, especially during the holidays. The cabin sat like a dark tooth in the middle of the woods, far from any neighbors who might hear a scream. Inside, Halloway was enjoying a glass of port. He was a man who believed he was untouchable. He had spent his career deciding who lived and who died, never imagining that the scale might one day tip back toward him. The first sign that his sanctuary had been breached was the sound of something heavy hitting the roof. Thump, thump, thump. A sudden, violent eruption of soot exploded from the fireplace, and the lights in the cabin died instantly. "Who's there?" Halloway's voice lacked the authority of the bench. Arthur stepped out of the shadows, his silicone mask catching the orange glow of the dying fire. He didn't speak. He simply held up a handful of rusted, heavy iron keys, the ones he had managed to smuggle out of the prison. Each key represented a man Holloway had sent away, but only one mattered tonight. The judge tried to scramble for his desk where he kept a revolver, but Arthur was faster. He caught the judge by the throat and forced him into his high-backed leather chair. Using a length of industrial wire, Arthur bound the judge's wrists to the armrests, threading the rusted keys into the wire so they bit deep into the skin with every movement. 10 years, James. Arthur's voice was a low, melodic rasp. In that cell, I had nothing but time. I counted the cracks in the walls. I counted the beats of my heart. Every second belonged to you. Now, I'm here to give them back. He didn't reach for a blade. Instead, he picked up a glass star from the judge's mantle, a sharp, heavy ornament that Holloway's wife had bought years ago. With a terrifying, methodical calm, Arthur forced the star into the judge's mouth, silencing the pleas before they could form. He didn't leave until the judge was a still, decorated monument to his own corruption. He left a hand-carved gavel on the judge's lap with one word etched into the wood: guilty. The night was cold, but Arthur's blood was boiling with a dark purpose as he headed back toward the lights of the city. His next target was David Vance, the prosecutor. Vance was the man who had truly enjoyed the trial. He'd treated Arthur's life like a game, a puzzle to be solved for his own glory. Vance's house was a modern mansion, all glass and sharp angles, located in the wealthiest district of Oakhaven. Arthur watched from the shadows of a large oak tree. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see a massive Christmas party in full swing. Men in tailored suits and women in silk dresses were laughing, drinking, and celebrating their success. Arthur saw Vance in the center of it all, holding a glass of champagne, looking like a man who hadn't a single regret in the world. Arthur didn't want to kill Vance, at least not yet. He knew that for a man like Vance, losing his life was nothing compared to losing his status. Arthur slipped through the back gardens, avoiding the security patrols with ease. He knew the layout of the house from the architectural plans he had studied in the prison library. He found the external server node for the home's smart system. With the patience of a man who had nothing left to lose, Arthur plugged in the small USB drive. He waited. Inside the ballroom, the upbeat jazz music suddenly died. The large television screens that had been showing festive images of snowy landscapes flickered and turned bright red. Then, the text began to scroll. It wasn't random. It was Vance's private emails, his offshore bank statements, and the evidence he had suppressed 10 years ago to make sure Arthur Finch stayed behind bars. The room went dead silent. Guests began to whisper, pointing at the screens, then at Vance. The prosecutor's face turned a sickly shade of white. He tried to tell his guests it was a prank, a hack, but the documents were too detailed, too real. His career was evaporating in front of his eyes. From the dark end of the hallway, a heavy bell rang once. Clang. Vance spun around. For a split second, he saw the massive figure in the red coat standing near the stairs. The mask seemed to be smiling at him. Arthur didn't move. He just pointed a gloved finger at the screens, then at Vance, and walked backward into the shadows of the service entrance. Vance ran after him, shouting for his security, but when they reached the garden, there was nothing but footprints in the snow that led nowhere. Arthur walked toward the center of Oakhaven. The town square was packed with people gathered around the massive Christmas tree for the midnight carols. The air was filled with the sound of "Joy to the World," a bitter irony that Arthur didn't miss. He saw a young woman sitting on a bench near the fountain, looking tired and cold. It was Sarah, the daughter of the only man who had tried to testify for Arthur 10 years ago, a man who had died in a suspicious car accident shortly after the trial. Arthur hesitated for the first time that night. He reached into his deep pocket and pulled out a small wooden bird, beautifully carved and painted in vibrant colors. It was the last thing he had made in his shop before the police had broken down his door. He walked past the bench and, without a word, set the bird down beside her. Sarah picked up the toy with a look of pure shock on her face. She recognized the craft. She knew who it was from. As she looked up to find him, Arthur was already gone, swallowed by the crowd of people in festive hats. The sirens were louder now. The news of the judge and the chaos at Vance's mansion was starting to break. People in the square were checking their phones, the singing was dying down, and a wave of unease was spreading. Arthur reached the old brick building that had once been his life, Finch's Fine Toys. It was boarded up, a skeleton of a place. A police cruiser screeched to a halt in front of the shop. Sheriff Miller jumped out, looking like a man who had seen a ghost. He was alone, having raced ahead of his deputies. He had his gun drawn, but his hands were shaking so violently that the weapon looked like it might fall. "Finch," Miller roared, his voice cracking. "I know you're here. You've ruined everything. Show yourself." Arthur stepped out from the shadows of the alley. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked slowly toward the middle of the street, the oxblood coat swaying with his heavy steps. The flashing blue lights of the cruiser made the silicone mask look even more terrifying. "Drop the gun, Arthur," Miller screamed. "I'll do it. I'll end this right now." Arthur stopped 10 feet away. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a small, old-fashioned music box. He wound it slowly, click, 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 and set it on the hood of the police car. The tinkling, sweet sound of Silent Night began to play, cutting through the heavy atmosphere. "You're not going to shoot, Miller," Arthur said, his voice quiet but filled with a strange power. "Because if you do, the world will never know where the rest of the evidence is hidden. I have copies of everything. The payoffs, the lies, the names of everyone involved. If I die, it all goes to the state police tonight. If I live, you might have a head start to run." Miller's face was a mask of pure terror. He looked at the music box, then at the man he had betrayed. He knew Arthur was right. He was trapped. "Why?" Miller whispered, his gun hand dropping to his side. "Why didn't you just kill me when you were in my house? You had the chance." Arthur leaned in close, so close that the sheriff could see the cold, hard reflection of his own fear in the eyes of the mask. "Because 10 years in a cage is a long time, Miller," Arthur whispered. "The walls close in a little more every day. The silence gets louder. I want you to feel that. I want you to count every second of your new life, just like I did." A loud bang echoed through the square, a firework from the midnight celebration. Miller flinched, his eyes snapping shut for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, the street was empty. The only thing left was the music box on the hood of his car, its melody winding down to a slow, haunting crawl. The police backup arrived minutes later, but Arthur Finch had vanished into the blizzard. They searched the old shop, the woods, and every road out of town, but Arthur was a ghost. He had spent 10 years planning this exit. As the sun began to rise on Christmas morning, a heavy, uncomfortable silence settled over Oakhaven. Sheriff Miller sat on the curb, knowing he was a dead man walking. The judge was a memory, Vance was a pariah, and the truth was a fire that couldn't be put out. Miles away, a hitchhiker in a plain gray jacket stood by the side of the highway. He had left the red coat and the silicone mask in a burning trash can behind a lonely gas station. His face was scarred and tired, but for the first time in a decade, his eyes were clear. He didn't have a list anymore. He didn't have a shop. But as he watched the first rays of the sun hit the snow, Arthur Finch realized he was finally free. He turned away from the road to Oakhaven and started walking, disappearing into the white horizon without ever looking back.